squeezing some of your time for the previous submission. It's good of you. Thank you very much. Can I call now to the table, please, Ryan Reynolds from Life and Vacant Spaces, Gap Filler and Greening the Rubble. Thank you. And it looks like we've got an extra paper that's just being circulated.
Yes, I brought 12 copies along,
yep,
so hopefully there's
helpful
enough for everyone. A little addendum there. Our initial submission talked more in terms of broad principles, and the addendum we've just circulated adds a few more details of specific wording and clauses.
Cool. Okay, Ryan, so welcome. You've been watching the process. We've got a limited amount of time, but hopefully enough for you to get your points across, so welcome.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity and for holding some of the select committee hearings down in Christchurch. We collectively, I think we very much do appreciate it. So I'm here representing Gap Filler today. This is Wendy Hodnott representing Greening the Rubble, and Jane Gregg representing Life and Vacant Spaces. I don't expect everyone's familiar with our organizations. So we're 3 different organizations that all started post-quake, and we differ very much in terms of our emphasis and our methodologies and the particular way we go about things. But in general, we share a vision to involve people in meaningful ways in the recovery of the city. And so collectively, we've been creating and facilitating mostly temporary public spaces and collaborative creative projects around the city. And initially, generally speaking, we set out to do this for the benefit of the community. And the thing we discovered along the way was that actually involving people and local organizations was not only good for them, it's actually been good for us and been good for the projects, the public artworks, the gardens, the buildings, and the amenities that we've jointly created, because involving people in that process, involving them in the creation of their communities, means that they have a greater stake in its present and its future. So they use the spaces more, they keep them active, they maintain them, they trial new startup businesses, and so on. So in short, we found that having such meaningful local participation early on in a project helps create spaces where positive social, economic, environmental, and cultural outcomes overlap, which to us might just be a definition of regeneration. So we made in our initial submission, I guess, 2.5 main points, and just to be confusing, I'll start with point 2. Post-disaster, pretty much all of the experts who have been coming to Christchurch, and there have been a lot of them, are talking of the importance of a holistic approach, and that to me refers to the sort of the 4 well-beings, the social, economic, environmental, and cultural. And all 3 of our organizations overwhelmingly have had a really positive experience with Christchurch City Council, who we feel truly act as custodians of the 4 well-beings and of the communities in terms of the Local Government Act. So we would like to see some of the minister's powers limited. We are, as you said, we like the idea of Regenerate Christchurch being truly a collaboration. And so now if you look at point 1 on the addendum around clause 42, subclause 3, which would give the minister the right to suspend, amend, or revoke an RMA document or a plan made under the LGA and a few other key acts. It was subclause 3 in particular that I think we'd like to see removed. The other subclauses refer to some other acts that we're less familiar with, but in general, we'd like to see that those clause 42 powers reevaluated in light of the principles throughout this submission. We also don't really understand the need to retain some of the provisions, such as in clauses 48 and 57, that would give the minister the right to engage in work on private land without the consent of property owners or to direct private landowners in certain regards. As we understand it, those provisions in the SARA Act were primarily regarding demolitions and the possible need for urgent demolitions of structures. And now, of course, we're faced not so much with demolitions, but with derelict sites. And our organizations have actually done extensive research on policies around the world to do with derelict sites and buildings. And in general, the worldwide trend is for local governments to maintain something like a vacant property register or a derelict sites register, and to have a system of either incentives or disincentives, either rates rebates if you make your site look nicer, or in some places rates penalties. You know, if your site's vacant for a few years, then your rates actually double, something like that. But in general, the worldwide trend overwhelmingly is for those sorts of registers to be dealt with by the local government rather than a central or a state authority. Point 2B of our initial submission had to do with Crown Co. And now I understand this particular legislation we're discussing isn't setting out the parameters of what Crown Co is and does and doesn't do. And in fact, we don't know too much about Crown Co. But in our view, if Crown Co ends up being a much larger and having a much larger budget than Regenerate Christchurch, then de facto the central government sort of power and influence over Christchurch will be much more than what the aspirations of the Regenerate Christchurch legislation. And so the only part in terms of the actual legislation, it was in clause 91, point C and D, where it lists that one of Regenerate Christchurch's functions is, and the wording is, to provide advice to Crown Co and Development Christchurch, and to comment on the contribution of, which to us sounds quite weak. If we're actually wanting to set up the idea of a collaboration, that Regenerate Christchurch is the sort of collaborative body truly overseeing things, and we don't make any specific suggestions for what the wording might be, but we'd like to see those particular clauses be a bit stronger in terms of the hierarchy, that the collaborative entity that is Regenerate Christchurch would have a bit more clout than either the entire council-owned Development Christchurch or entire Crown-owned Crown Co. And then our last point, which we consider to be our main point, that refers to point 1 in our original submission, and I'll refer to share an idea. So the first major Central Christchurch Recovery Plan, of course, was developed on the back of Share an Idea, which was a widely heralded community consultation campaign. But overwhelmingly, the people of Christchurch feel that their voices were not heard or listened to, and that there have been virtually no opportunities to re-engage in the subsequent 4.5 years. It feels a bit like a one-off exercise. I think we all feel that way ourselves, but regardless of the truth of that assertion, the fact that that's the general perception is bad for the regeneration of the city. The fact that people feel disempowered, feel that they weren't listened to, it is unequivocally a negative. So looking at the purposes of the Act, particularly its clause 3C, that currently states one of the purposes of Regenerate Christchurch to be enabling community participation in the planning of the regeneration of Greater Christchurch. We suggest just a few amendments here. One is to add the word ongoing, so the idea that the consultation is not a one-off exercise, but that there are opportunities for follow-up on that. Also, we'd like to add the words beside community and local not-for-profit or third sector participation. So we find a lot of the time, I mean, our own organizations, we don't feel that they're wonderfully well-resourced, but we have a little bit of organizational resource and we have some paid staff, and so we're in a better position to, for instance, make a submission on this sort of legislation and devote the time to that than your average resident. And the last thing is at the end of that clause, so when it talks of community participation in the planning of the regeneration of Greater Christchurch, we'd like to add, and throughout the implementation and execution of those plans as well. I probably don't want to get down into the detail as the previous submissions talking about tamaki and what form of consultation that might be. I think if you set it up front in the purposes, that's the aspiration in general, and then leave it to the Regenerate Christchurch Committee to figure out the best way to implement that. But just as we were sitting there, I'll just close now, Wendy sort of whispered to me during one of the previous submissions, she said, you know, she feels a lot more connected to the community and to the city of Christchurch through her work with the Greening the Rubble organization than through her professional work as a professional landscape architect. And that's a shame. But that's the case for most people. And so I guess the aspiration behind these amendments that we're recommending is just to create more avenues for people to create and find that connection to the city.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. David Parker's got a question.
Yes, you suggest in your submission that some of the provisions in clause 42 of the bill ought to be reconsidered. I'm not sure I properly understand that point, because it seems to me that if you are going to have regeneration plans that effectively have power to overwrite some of the rules that would otherwise apply, and that's actually why you're having these plans, the Minister needs to be able to give effect to that by varying the provisions in existing plans that run contrary to the rules that are being proposed in a regeneration plan.
Okay. Then perhaps it's the nature of how those powers are enacted, because I would rather see the powers through the board of Regenerate Christchurch or through the chair of Regenerate Christchurch.
Right.
And if the powers actually need, for statutory reasons, to be held by the minister, then I would like to see some relationship where the board of Regenerate Christchurch could make that request, or maybe that the request needs to originate from the board of Regenerate Christchurch, and then the minister is the one to enact.
So you acknowledge that if you're going to have regenerate plans, that someone needs to have that plan, but you think it should be more prescribed as arising from the from the regeneration plans.
I think so.
Okay, rightio. Thank you.
Eugenie?
You say in your submission we have almost uniformly found central government institutions to be unresponsive, unsupportive, unable to navigate their own bureaucracies to deliver good community outcomes, and generally uninformed about the many and diverse communities in Christchurch. Do you think do you think that is because of the institutions themselves, the power they have had under the CERA legislation, or the fact that they are based often in Wellington? What is it, and is it,
I mean, it would be speculation, but from my perspective, I think the choice to run the recovery of the city as a government ministry politicized the whole exercise. And so, I mean, I can give an instance where Life in Vacant Spaces was approached by staff members within CERA and CCDU to propose some temporary interim use activities on the East Frame, one of the anchor projects. And they stipulated a few requirements, that it couldn't just be the normal sort of stuff that we do, but needed to be a little more polished, a little bigger scale. We went off and worked with a lot of our partners, developed a proposal, and it went through a process where it got approved by, was it 18 or 19 different staff members within CERA, by the operations team and the legal team and whatever, and it landed on the desk of Warwick Isaacs, and he didn't sign, he didn't make the 19th or 20th signature, whatever it was. And that whole process took 9 months.
right?
And this is when you're trying to do quick response, temporary activities, make the best use of a temporarily available site. And I think it was because every decision has political consequence and political risk when it's a government ministry. And so, the organization seemed to lack an ability to delegate power down the chain.
I guess one of the tensions for the committee dealing with the bill is how to provide that flexibility and not prescribe processes too much.
That's it.
Pardon?
That's it.
Yeah. Sorry, that was,
No,
thinking out loud.
Yeah, that was
Sure.
thinking out loud
Comment on
stuff.
that.
Sure.
It's the stuff